I want to do a few more examples. So 4.1 is from the book. It is a problem that I typically assign, but I want to go ahead and set this up. I'm not going to finish it, but let's go ahead and read this problem and set it up. So this problem tells you to write a class called counter that represents a simple tally counter, which might be used to count people as they enter a room. The counter class should contain a single integer as instance data representing the count. Write a constructor to initialize the count to 0. Write a method called click that increments the count, and write another method called getCount that returns the current count. Include a method called reset that resets the counter to 0. Finally, create a driver class called counterTest that creates two counter objects and tests their methods. Alright, so let's think about our counter class. So if you read the description, it actually gives you a lot of the information that you need. It did tell you that you need instance data for the count. So we're going to have instance data that's going to keep track of the count. The other thing the instructions told you is you need a method called getCount that is going to return the count, reset, which is going to reset the count to 0, and click, which is going to increment count by 1. So we need to create all those methods. Another method that you need is a toString method. Now, whenever you do any work for me, you always have to override the toString method. Now, the one method the instructions did not tell you to create is a setCount. Setting the count is actually something that can be done on a tally counter, but according to the book instructions, they don't want you to do this method. But I'm going to go ahead and write it down because I think it will help me explain this a little better. So here's a picture of a tally counter. Now, when you press this button here, it's going to increment this value by 1. And then when you want to reset, you turn this knob right here and you can reset it to 0. Now, you can actually turn this knob and not reset it to 0. Like, these knobs will spin, but you can stop spinning it before it gets to 0. So technically there's a way that you can actually set the value to something other than 0 or increment it by 1. So that's what we're going to create a blueprint class for. Alright, so I created a tally counter. Now I went ahead and put the buttons on the side. So we'll just say like one button is a click and the other button is a reset. Now you're going to use these two buttons to control the value that gets displayed. So the value right here is the count. So when we look at this tally counter, we know that our count is the instance data and our interfaces is clicking or resetting. So our diagram for our object will look like this. So here's our object. Our instance data is inside of our object protected because it's declared as private. Now the only way to modify this instance data, so the client that uses this object can click, can reset, and can get the value of the count. Getting the value of count would be the equivalent of us looking at what the count is. So we simply just look at the count and observe what the value is. So now that we have a better picture of what a tally counter is, what instance data we need, what interfaces we need, let's go ahead and design this class. So here is my counter blueprint class. I haven't actually added anything to it except for comments. So I made comments so that I have notes to myself of what I need to do. Now in my constructor, I said that count needs to be initialized to 0 because that's what the instructions said in the program problem. I made a comment to add a getter. Now I didn't make a comment to add a setter because the instructions didn't actually tell me I needed it. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it off. I do need a method to click. The click method will increment count by 1. Then I have a reset method. The reset method is going to set count to 0. And then I made a comment here to override it. Now the only thing I need to override is the toString method. So I'm going to go ahead and create my instance data. And here's my instance data. I named it count. Now I want to go ahead and create my constructor. So here's my constructor. In the instructions for this program, the instructions tell me to set count to 0. So instead of setting count to 0, I went ahead and just called a reset. When I create my reset method, I'm going to set count to 0. So it's pretty much the same thing. So instead of setting count is equal to 0, I'm just calling reset. Now it's also important to note that if I don't initialize my data, it automatically gets set to 0. So technically speaking, having a constructor that sets count to 0 is unnecessary because it's already being done. But I'm going to go ahead and do what the instructions tell me to do. So I'm going to go ahead and set count to 0 in my constructor by calling the reset method. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my getter. So here's my getter. In my getter, I'm returning an integer because my count is declared to be an integer. And in my return statement, I simply just return count. Now I'm going to go ahead and add click and reset. I'm not going to complete those methods. I'm going to leave that up to you to complete them. And then I'm going to add the toString method. And here are the methods I created. I made a method for click. No, I didn't actually do any programming statements in here because this is a homework problem. I'll let you figure out how to increment count by 1. Then I have the reset method. Again, I don't have any programming statements in here because I want you to set count to 0. And the last thing I do is override my toString method and I return a string. The string I'm returning is the name of the class and then the instance data of count. So whenever I invoke my toString method, I'm going to see the count. Now the next thing we need to do is create a driver class that is going to test this blueprint class. The name of the class should be counterTest and it should instantiate two counters according to the instructions and test all of its methods. So I'm going to leave this up to you to finish it.